Welcome to another week of Global Christians Perspectives. This week, again, joined by Chris Eyre from England. He's my co-host, and he's an editor for Nergion Publishing. This week we have two guests. Back with us again is Dr. Tony Mitchell from Wappingers Falls, New York, a chemical educator who is currently working on a book, The Science of Creation, for Nergion. And also joining us this week from Ohio is Alan Bevere. He's a pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Akron, Ohio, and a professional fellow at the theology at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio. Welcome, everybody. And this week we're going to be starting off with something hopefully more in line. Let me get the banner off here. There we go. We're starting off hopefully a little bit positive, which is the New Horizons encounter with the planet Neptune that occurred this week. This is something that's a little bit personal for me in the sense that the last planetary encounter we had was Voyager 2's encounter with the planet Neptune, of which I was lucky enough to play a small role being on the Voyager flight team for that encounter. That was back in 1989, August of 1989. So I was very anxious to have New Horizons get to Pluto. It's the last of the 9 planets, or what were at least 9 planets when I was born. We'll skip over whether Pluto is a planet or not. And I think it's actually just really a nice milestone that we've now have visited all 9 planets of the solar system. So anyone have any comments on that? Chris, starts out.
Okay, nobody speak at once.
Well, I certainly favor every extra move towards anything that might actually get some of humanity off this planet. This is partly because I'm extremely pessimistic about whether we can actually manage to control ourselves enough to leave it habitable in the long term.
I found it interesting this morning that there are conspiracy theorists out there who said it didn't occur. You know, I'm trying to figure out how for 10 years we kept it quiet. If it's, the longer something takes place, the less likely it is to be a conspiracy. And people are saying that this was all photoshopped and you name it, NASA took the money and spent it on something.
Well, as a former employee of NASA, actually Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, I can assure you completely that it wasn't, and that the moonshot was also not faked. But then I have to honestly admit that since I was an employee of NASA and worked for JPL, that I'll obviously be part of the conspiracy. So can you really believe anything I say?
Well, Tony, I'm certain that there are those conspiracy theorists out there who are probably certain you don't exist either. So we could probably just move on with that. I guess when my eschatology makes me more optimistic than Chris on this, but I would say that it was just wonderful to see the flyby of this planet that has been known to us, but has been so mysterious, and to just see the pictures, and whenever these kinds of things happen, it is just a reminder to me of Psalm 8 and the grand creation that we live in.
Yeah. Now there is one question that always pops up along these lines. I know I heard it quite a bit back in the 70s when we were going to the moon and first sending probes to Mars. And that is, should we be spending money on this with all the problems in the world? Is this a good way to spend our money?
I think the short answer to that, from my perspective, is yes. I realize that nations and governments and businesses and individuals waste money. We could do a better job of spending our money, but I think when we talk about the fact that we shouldn't be spending our money on these kinds of things, I think we miss two things. I think first we miss the fact that I think God has made us natural explorers. We're naturally inquisitive, and so we want to know. I think the second thing is that when people make that claim, they do not understand the benefits we have received from space exploration and technology, even in the medical profession. I mean, if it wasn't for space exploration, we wouldn't have CAT scans and PET scans and MRIs, programmable pacemakers, for example, laser angioplasty. I mean, so many of the things that benefit us are a result of our technology that we have discovered because of going into space. So I do think it's a wonderful endeavor. I wish we were more aggressive. That's all I'll say.
Well, I would follow up on what Alan said. I missed part of that. I'm having some connection problems. But we spend so much money on war and destruction. It would be very easy, I say that with quotes and slightly sarcastic, to take some of that money and move it into space exploration and other humanitarian efforts. Everybody complains about the amount of money we spend on science basic research. We don't know what's there. We've got to go find it. But nobody seems to complain about the amount of money we're spending on war, and that they're not in balance. We need to shift it towards these kinds of explorations.
Well, I also think that we can definitely we get a lot from space exploration. It's more than just nice pictures of planets that are long, far away. When I was at JPL, I worked on what was then a brand new and emerging technology called GPS. And think about how GPS now changes your lives and changes the way you think about your lives today. So a lot of times what we see around us comes from exploration. As an engineer, I know there's some people who can do real abstract research. For me, that's probably why I'm an engineer. I deal much better if there's a particular problem I have to face. And if you look at the advances made throughout history, most of the advances are not people sitting around and thinking things up. Most of the advances that have come about in history are from people facing particular problems and trying to work around those problems. And in the process, they develop new technologies that are useful, and then evolve into even newer technologies down the road. So we don't know exactly what we're going to get from the space program, but we can be pretty sure it'll be positive. And I also think there's an aspect of, in Proverbs, if people do not have a vision, then they perish. And I think we need to keep a vision of where we're going, and not always be so wrapped up in the problems of this world. We need to think about actually going someplace beyond what we do here.
By the way, it's always been my dream, just so you know, that I will be the first theologian on the moon. I doubt that will happen, but that's my dream.
I'd be happy enough just to get there.
I've been particularly interested to see that there seems now to be a lot of evidence that Pluto is a fairly young planet compared with the rest of the solar system, and there could be an awful lot of information there as to the early formation of planets, which could actually tell us more about the planet we're living on, as well as Pluto at the outer regions of the solar system. So I look forward to them doing the analysis there.
Okay. Any other comments?
No, I'm good with it.
Well, let's just we talked a little bit about whether we should spend our money on scientific research or on war. I would certainly be in the let's spend it on scientific research camp. Let's switch topics now to our other topic for the week, which is the Iran deal. and whether it is going to be a good thing or a bad thing, whether it should be supported and ratified, particularly in the U.S. Senate. Although there's some issues there and details about the way they're doing things, it's not technically going to be ratified. But that aside, should this be something that we should support and get behind, or something we should oppose and try to stop? Chris, you want to jump in?
Well, I think it's a thoroughly positive thing in that we haven't had any particular influence over what Iran has been doing. They've certainly been able to produce enriched uranium weapons-grade materials for some time, and part of this agreement is that they will stop doing that and disassemble some of the facilities they've been using to do that. So I see this as a positive diplomatic step in the direction of reducing the likelihood of proliferation of nuclear weapons. My only caveat there is I wouldn't want to guarantee that they haven't already constructed themselves one or two.
Someone want to jump in?
Well, I'm going to agree with Chris. I think that if we deny, or if the Senate can or will, if the Senate were to turn this down, we're not going in a direction of peace.
Alan.
Well, I guess I'm sort of in the middle on this. I would say this is what I would call an understandable gamble on behalf of the Obama administration. I mean, I understand their point. Their point is, as Chris says, nothing really has worked. Let's bring our foes closer together, closer to us, and let's see what we can do to have influence. The situation in Iran is not quite like North Korea. I disagree with the comparisons in some respects. The Iranian population seems to be pro-Western and want to be involved. You have moderates in the government there who I think want to be more in line with the community of nations. The big dilemma is, it seems to me, is twofold. One is the hardliners within the government, and over time, how much influence will they have? At the same time, there's always, in anything you do, the unexpected. What's going to happen with ISIS and what's going on there? Is Iran going to use some of their revenue to fund other groups in reference to terrorism? I mean, so there's a part of me that says, I understand what's going on here, and I think it's a good effort, a good try on behalf of the Obama administration, but I also think it has potential to be a huge disaster. I mean, I'm not a, I mean, I just think there's time to, I mean, I think we need time to, I'm not sure I want to jump on board and throw my hands up in the air and say this is wonderful. At the same time, I think we got to see what happens with it. I think one of the big issues is going to be, how can the UN do the inspections? That's a big issue. Can they really do the inspections in an effective way?
Okay. Well, I think I'll wrap up this initial round, and then we'll go and start talking about it in more detail. Seems like we went from supportive to in the middle, and I'm very, very strongly against. I think this deal is a disaster. We had sanctions in place because the world community thought it was a horrible thing should Iran get the bomb. This is, in my mind, removing sanctions and giving them the bomb. The deal depends on them not cheating, but I think the question is pretty clear. The UN cannot monitor this deal. For one, we were promised anywhere, anytime inspections. And what we got is we have to give them 24 days notice. So we have to basically request permission to investigate. And then 24 days later, after the process ends, we may actually get to go investigate that. 24 days, you can hide anything you want. So there's no question in my mind they've been cheating up to this point. They've been caught several times, and they'll continue to cheat. Even if they don't, however, assume they will follow by every dot and tittle of the agreement. In 10 years, they're free to get a bomb. And in the meantime, they can develop their centrifuge technology. They can improve centrifuges such that instead of having centrifuges that will create 6 bombs, they'll have centrifuges that will create 30 to 40 bombs. It's going to destabilize the area because as they get a bomb, the other areas are already, Saudi Arabia, some of the other areas, Egypt and Turkey are already talking about nuclearizing, and I think that's liable to, in and of itself, lead to a nuclear weapon, a nuclear war. The United States and Soviet Union had very tough time not getting into nuclear war, and they had very strong political control, very strong command and control systems, and they were in what was called mutually assured destruction. So they weren't in a use it or lose it position. That will not be the case with some of the countries that are now going to get nuclear weapons because of this. And on something else, we're going to give them a signing bonus, effectively, of $160 billion. This is a country that's the largest supporter of state terrorism in the world, and they have an economy of $300 to $400 billion. And now we're going to give them another 160. That would be like handing the United States $8 trillion. What's that money going to be used for? My guess is it's just going to go into further destabilizing the area, further funding terrorism around the world. So I think you're going to end up with, as the Israeli ambassador put it, you're going to have very likely a greater increase of conventional war in the near future and a much greater likelihood of nuclear war in the future. So I think this is a step towards war, not a step towards peace.
I would
well,
say,
Elgin, I think your points are well taken. I mean, I think one of the gambles here is that the Obama administration is hoping that 10 years from now, a moderate government will be in control, and I think that's the hope. Now, nobody knows whether that's the case, but the other issue is there are lots of unknowns here, and that's why, So I guess what I would say is if this works, President Obama will go down as a great engineer of foreign policy in the Middle East. If it doesn't work, he's going to be looked on as the opposite, and there's going to be a lot of calamity. I mean, I'm not willing to celebrate this deal, but I'm also not willing to throw it down the sewer at the moment.
I don't actually see Iran as nearly as much of a threat as Elgin does. State-sponsored terrorism, yes, they support Hezbollah. The Saudis are waging a proxy war in Yemen at the moment. It's Saudi money that largely supports Al-Qaeda, and I think Boko Haram and Janjaweed in Africa. They've got to have a good claim to being the biggest local sponsor of state terrorism. And if you look at it from a geopolitical point of view, Iran is, at least to some extent, a counterbalance for Saudi Arabia. The Saudi regime is not necessarily as stable as it might be. Islamic State would very much like to topple the Saudi royal family, who are not as popular as they. We could see an Islamic State run Saudi Arabia with quite a lot of support in it. If we don't have a local counterbalance to that, I think we'd have a far less stable situation. Now, the current Iranian government is somewhat more moderate than it was under, for instance, Ahmadinejad. We know from the days before the Islamic takeover that there's a substantial Western-leaning population in Iran. Sanctions sever their connection with the West, and they therefore have a tendency to stop us projecting our values even more onto the already somewhat westward-leaning population. Yes, there are possible negatives, but as I see it, the alternative is military action, and I absolutely would not support any military action.
I'm one of those. Okay, there's a deal. You know, if say they got to give us 24 or 24 days notice, or we've got to give them 24 days notice for inspection. What's to keep us from planting a satellite in the geocentric synchronous orbit over the site just to see what traffic they have? I would hope that we have other things in place that we haven't let people know we're doing. I mean, there was a thing on Nova a couple months ago that we got some virus into their centrifuges. You know, it's probably not the Christian thing to do, but if they're going to cheat, so can we. You know, and the other side of it is we know the outcome. Everybody knows the outcome of a nuclear war. And I cannot honestly believe that anybody would ever willingly set off a nuclear weapon. Now, there may be some people that think that they would, but you know, the moderate.
Let me respond to that if I can real quick.
Yep.
I actually do think there are people who would be willing. I think that we too often underestimate the powerful religious convictions of people who believe that they are doing whatever the will of God, whatever that might be, and that in order to achieve those ends, they are willing to do whatever is necessary. And I think that we are naive. I mean, look, I agree with you. I think that the normal rational person would never think about this. I mean, that's what kept the Cold War from becoming a nuclear war, is that even though we didn't like the Soviets, they were rational enough to know that they would lose in a nuclear exchange. But when you get people, particularly backed by what I would call religious zealotry, as a minority as they are in Islam, and they are a minority, nevertheless, nuclear weapons in the hands of some of them could be disastrous. I mean, that's my concern, and that we're being a little naive in thinking that there aren't people out there that wouldn't use them.
I think there's a case can be made they would. I remember hearing a news report 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer, where one of their generals was asked about the possibility of a nuclear exchange with Israel, and the fact that they might bomb Israel, but Israel supposedly has nuclear weapons and that they would retaliate. And the general replied, we would lose 30 to 40 million people. They have a population of about 70 or 80, I think. So he was saying they would effectively lose half their population. But he went on to say, but Israel would be gone. And I think one of the other aspects is in Islam, there's obviously not all Islam, but there's a faction within Islam, particularly Sunni Islam, that has a view of Armageddon similar to Christians, except they believe it's their duty to bring it about. And as a result of bringing it about, the 12th Imam will come back. And you know, putting nuclear weapons into the hands of people who believe it's their duty to bring about an apocalypse so the 12th Imam comes back, I think that's a very risky thing to do.
Yeah, may I simply say, just add to that, and I'll be quiet and listen, is that it's my opinion that Western liberalism, and I use liberalism here with a capital L, that Western liberalism underestimates the power of religious convictions too often. And not only the power of religious convictions for the good, but especially religious convictions for evil.
Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah. I don't personally see that we have a sufficient interest in aggravating Iran to justify really heavy sanctions in the first place. I have in mind, for instance, that conventional force wise, Iran controls the Straits of Hormuz and quite a lot of the world's oil leaves through there. They have actually not been playing particularly nasty recently. I don't think that there's any real likelihood that we, that is, Europe or America, are going to be targets of that. So it is to a great extent a local issue in any event. Yes, I know that there are some very strong religious views. They are a minority. I can point out that we have elements within Christianity who say, bring on the apocalypse, let's have a war in the Middle East because that's what's predicted, with which I don't agree in the slightest. But if we're pointing to Islam and saying that they have a lunatic fringe, so does Christianity. I don't necessarily trust our own leaders either. I sat down with a small group of conservative politicians at the time of the Falklands War, and to my utter horror, they were seriously suggesting nuking Buenos Aires. That's England. We're supposed to be civilized. And that was a set of politicians of what was at the time the ruling party. Admittedly, it was a small group of them, but is anybody trustworthy? I mean, if we are going to worry along those lines, should we not be even more worried about the fact that both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons? Pakistan is Sunni Islam. It doesn't control, to a great extent, Taliban in its northern territories. It's a fairly unstable regime, and Pakistan and India have actually been at war 4 times during my lifetime. Most recently in 1999, they have permanent border clashes in Kashmir. If there's a world war going to start from a local conflict, I think they're probably a better candidate at the moment.
That actually is correct. The big issue will be that they already have nuclear weapons. Preventing them from getting them is not really an option. I'd also argue that I don't think, by the way, war is the only option at this point. I don't see it as this treaty or war. I actually think the sanctions were working. That's what brought Iran to the table. As the problem I have is that we eased up the sanctions to make it easier on them to negotiate, and then we gave all the concessions. I don't really know of any concession that Iran has actually given up. I know a lot of concessions we made, including the concession made at the last minute that we would not include anything about the interballistic missile program that Iran is also developing that would allow them to hit both Europe and the United States. But we're pretty much out of time on this section, but we're going to transition into the next section here. But at this point, in the kind of before we go into our next section, I'd like to give each of you a chance to introduce any websites, books, anything you want to plug. So tell people, where they can get in contact with you, or where they can read more of your information. Chris, do you want to start off?
Oh, I blog at airlinesenergium.net. I have not as yet written a book. There is one in preparation. When that arrives, Lord knows.
We'll look forward to it. Tony?
Again, my blog is Thoughts from the Heart on the Left. I was talking with a friend the other day, and her comment was, "My heart's in the right place." I commented, "Well, last time I never took biology, but I do know my heart's on the left. That's where I put everything." And I may bring back some of the stuff that I did in the '60s about my science fair and a trip to the moon. I've actually got some stuff on that because that was what I did, going back to our early work. That's where I'm at.
Okay, and Alan?
Well, I blog at alanbevere.com. That's Alan with 2 L's and 2 A's. And I suppose the book that I've written for Nergian on some of the issues we've talked about is Politics of Witness. It's a very brief book because it's part of the Areopagus series that I co-edit with Dave Black, but one of my projects at some point is to write an expanded volume and be more detailed about each of the chapters.
Okay. Well, now we're going to move into our more in-depth section, and in this section we're going to spin off of the Iran. We're going to leave Iran behind per se, although I wouldn't be surprised if it popped up a little bit. Try to focus this more a little bit on general question of the issues of Christians and war. I don't particularly agree with it, but let's say, for example, the issue is, do we support this treaty or do we support going to war to stop them to develop a nuclear weapon? How do Christians approach the general subject of war in general? How do they make a decision? Are all wars bad? Would that include, for example, World War II, which is generally considered to be a good war? Should Christians just become pacifists and not take place in any war at all, or should Christians, be more selective? And if so, on what basis can they say we're going to support this war but not that one? I think we'd probably all be in agreement. I think everybody in agreement that no one wants to support every war, but how do Christians approach this subject in general? Who would like to start with that?
I'm torn on this issue. The more I read of the Gospels in particular, the more I think that I probably ought to go to the complete pacifist position. But I'm not entirely sure that's functional in the real world. I don't like Augustine's just war concept as developed by Aquinas very much. But in any event, if we were at least to stick to Augustine's just war principle, there are very few wars that this country would have fought over the last 150 years, which would actually have happened, and probably World War II is the striking exception to that. The Falklands may also be an exception because there was an invasion of our territory.
Chris, you want to jump in? Chris, you there?
Did you not hear any of that?
I heard. How
About
about
the tail end, I'm having technical problems on my end.
Okay, let's go to Alan real quick then. Alan?
Sure. Well, I think Chris's point on Augustine's just war, I mean, I think there are two questions to ask in reference to his just war tradition. The first is, given modern warfare, are the criteria that no longer make sense? But I think the second thing is that when people talk just war, they really today are only talking about going to war for a just reason. If you follow Augustine's criteria for just war, he has a criterion where even if your cause is just, but you cannot fight the war and win it justly, your only option is surrender. So I try and picture a president of the United States getting before the American people and say, we have decided that even though the cause is just, we cannot fight this war justly and win it, and therefore we're going to sue for peace. I mean, I'm just trying to picture that. I don't think that would happen. So I do think that if you're going to talk about just war, those who want to speak about it need to be more rigorous in what that means in the 21st century. That's my first thought. And I'll stop there, and I'll contribute a little bit later.
Tony, are you back with us?
I hope so. I'm having some connectivity
question.
I'm torn. I remember my father was a career. My grandfather was a career Army officer. My father was a career Air Force officer, and I've had the benefit of reading my grandfather's notes on World War I, which really just gave me a part of the story. And my father once made a comment that he was scheduled to be part of the third wave of the invasion of Honshu Island. That's one of the main islands of Japan. Mm-hmm. And his was the wave that was going to be alive. And that was the thinking that allowed President Truman to decide we should drop the bombs. I bring that up because the test site, the Trinity test was what anniversary was yesterday. Mm-hmm. I am not a pacifist. I got into an argument a couple years ago about being a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. I'd much rather not go to war. If I'm going to go to war, the military background that I got says if you go in to win. Now, we also know at this point what effect that's going to have on our post-war. You know, the number of veterans. If we're not prepared to do what it takes to win the war and then revitalize the world that we have helped destroy and help bring the soldiers back, you have to create an environment where the soldiers go in willing to kill, and then you got to turn them around and say you've got to forget everything you've done. You know, I've not done the study of just war. I basically say war's not worth the effort. I'll go back 100 and some years. Robert E. Lee saying it's, you know, war. It's wonderful. It's great that the war is so terrible because we would grow tired of it. And I'm afraid that we have grown very fond of war. And I'll go back to something we said way back at the beginning. Let's take some of the money that we've been pumping into our military defense, calling it defense. It's really not for the military, it's for the complex. And some of the money we're putting into Homeland Security, let's move that into, let's revitalize the Peace Corps. Let's build instead of destroy. That's my take on it.
Tony, let me say something real quick and quote Robert E. Lee about it's a good thing war's not is a terrible thing, otherwise we grow too fond with it. This has been my concern in the last few years in reference to drone warfare and in reference to some of the robotic technology, that once you can begin to have use violence, use drones and other robotic technology to achieve your ends, once you no longer have to send people to risk their lives, does it become easier then to go to war? That's a concern.
Well, it's the same thing in basic training. You have to desensitize the infantry, the ground soldier, the infantryman. You have to desensitize them. They have to understand that they're not killing a person. That makes drone warfare so wonderful because you're so far away from it. Two thoughts jump into mind. One is an episode of MASH where a pilot got shot down. He was an Air Force pilot, and he was talking how cavalier it was. You know, he took off from Tokyo, flew over Korea, dropped his weapons, came home for dinner, and he gets shot down. Hawkeye makes him carry litters of patients so that he suddenly realizes what he was doing. And there was a Star Trek episode where war had been computerized. And Spock, it was all computerized, so Spock kills destroys one of the computers, and forces the two planets that have been at war for centuries to suddenly negotiate, to discuss war, because it suddenly became real to them.
Let me come in
Science
with
fiction
a
for
contrary
moral
view here.
lessons. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, let me come in with a contrary view here. Yeah, I remember that Star Trek episode. I don't think they necessarily desensitize you. I mean, maybe it's just my personal experience. And when I went into the Air Force, I grew up around guns. I learned how to shoot at an early age. And I still remember the first day. They do desensitize you in a bit, but it's not because it's not a human. I remember when we went down into the rifle range and we shot for the first time, and they brought up the targets, and the target was the silhouette of a man, or a silhouette of a person, to be politically correct. And that was very unnerving to me, because my entire life I had been trained not to shoot, not even to point a gun anywhere near a person. And suddenly here I was shooting at a target in the shape of a person, and that unnerved me a bit. For me, I approach this in the sense of starting at a individual level and then scaling it up. I do believe we have a duty to self-defense. I mean, a right of self-defense, and also a duty to prevent evil being inflicted on other people. Give the classic example is if a man is about ready to stab a little child, and you have the ability to shoot and kill them, should you do so? For me, it's not a hard question. I would say certainly you do. You're protecting innocent life at that point. And then my view of war is scaling that up. So I do have, I'm not exactly a follower of Augustine in terms of that, because I do agree that the principles of war and the warfare that he wrote his Just War Theory is vastly different than the war we have today. So I would argue that we have not only a right but sometimes a duty, but we do have to take into account, what is our ability? What's going to be left over behind? What are the results? I think all of those are that Tony raised. Those are all very valid questions, and we need to be prepared to face all of them. Drone warfare does concern me for that very reason. Actually, for an additional reason. If you send in a squad of SEALs to capture somebody, there's the chance that one of those SEALs or more will be killed. Something could go wrong. A helicopter could crash. I mean, all sorts of things could go wrong, and we could lose soldiers. If you send in a drone strike, it seems much easier. But one of the things is you're also liable to have much larger casualties on the field. So if you send in a SEAL team, they can extract somebody and either extract them or take them out, depending on what you're doing, with a minimum of casualties. If you send in a drone strike, you're liable to have far more casualties on the ground for people who happen to be nearby when the explosion goes off. So that whole move to drones concerns me greatly as well.
Elgin, may I ask you a question on that? Because I listen to you talk and I say, my gosh, if you were running for Congress, I'd probably vote for you. Because when I hear politicians, particularly when they speak of some kind of action, whether in war or violence, I don't hear that concern, and that's what bothers me. I can deal with politicians who say we need to do this, but do it in a way, do it in a sorrowful way, in a way that this is the only thing we can do. I wish more of our leaders were that self-reflective, and that's what bothers me often. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I would caution you, to be careful about viewing politicians, because we view them through the media. Right. And as we were kind of briefly discussing before we got going here, maybe one of these days we'll do a discussion on the media, but the media is not always to be trusted.
Oh, I agree.
For example, I've read a number of the books on the discussion leading up to the Gulf War, and it's irrelevant for the point whether you thought that was good, bad, or different. I actually think it's a little silly to call that a rush to war, because there were several years of discussions and debates going back and forth, and people wrestled with a lot of these issues. No, it doesn't make it out onto the evening news, and you don't always see it. And in fact, I remember when I went to a political, it's completely off war, but I went to a political speech once by a sitting governor, and he opened up his speech with a 5-minute about jokes about his candidate, his opponent, and then he went in and for 20 minutes he laid out what he had done, and then for the next 20 minutes he laid out what he planned to do in his second term. So a 45-minute speech, 5 minutes warming up the crowd with some jokes, 20 minutes on substance about what he thought he had accomplished, 20 minutes on substance about what he hoped to do in the future. I watched the news report that night. They only gave a clip of one of the jokes, and then when they transferred it back to the anchor team, the lead anchor asked the reporter, when are they going to actually talk about issues? And the reporter, who had been in the room and watched the entire 45-minute speech, said, I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
well, listen, I mean, I'm with you on
that's what the media says.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's appropriate at this point to quote Tom Wright, the biblical scholar, who says, only journalists can put 2 and 2 together and come up with 17. So, I mean, I get that.
I actually do think politicians on both sides are a lot more thoughtful and reflective, and actually do consider a lot of these issues than is oftentimes given credit for. It's very easy to paint somebody who you disagree with as, well, they're just being knee-jerk and reflexive, whether that's reflexive to go to war or reflexive to go to peace. I think people on both sides, these are, as we began here, these are difficult issues, and I think politicians, not all of them, of course, but I think a number of them struggle with these as well.
I agree. I'm with you.
Chris, Tony, you want to jump in?
I actually spent some time in local politics, and I can attest that the only way of getting reported properly in the press is to write their copy for them and hand it to them. Otherwise, what gets printed has no relation to what you actually said most of the time. Hopeless. Back to the war bit. I also spent some time in the 80s and into the 90s as a civil defence scientific advisor. In other words, one of the people who provides scientific information to the military and civil authorities in case of war, particularly looking at the effects of nuclear, chemical and biological at the time. And this gave me a fairly keen appreciation of how the military thought about these things, because I was knocking around with army officers quite a bit of the time, actually doing war-gamed exercises. I go back to Augustine, and Augustine had 2 prongs to his just war theory. There was waging war in the first place, rightly, and there was waging war in the right way once you were actually fighting a war. The snag is my long talks with army officers, often in the pub after an exercise, led me to think that once you are in a war, you are an idiot if you do not do everything that is necessary to win it as quickly and cleanly as possible. And considering how you wage it has to come second. And the 2 are in tension from my point of view. And as I say, my attitude has moved more towards the pacifist over the years. And at the moment, I am not sure that it is possible to wage war sensibly, but also wage it in a humane way.
Tony, you want to jump in?
No.
Well, let me comment on that last part of it, because I do think that's a classic tension. I know, for example, in the Gulf War, one of the big issues there was the first and second Battle of Fallujah. When they went into Fallujah, I had a friend of mine whose son was in the battle, and they were called back. They were told to stand down when they were very close to actually winning. And I don't know if any of you have have read any of Victor David Hanson's work. If not, I'd recommend them highly. But he's a historian of war, and one of the things he comments on is that once a war starts, you either fight it to victory, or you may postpone it for a while. But if one side doesn't win over the other, then you're basically only guaranteeing that you're going to have another war in the future. And for example, the Peloponnesian War is a 31-year-long war, but in the middle of it, they actually had a peace. But the peace didn't actually settle anything. They just sort of stopped fighting. So the underlying reasons for the war were still there. And a few years later, those reasons broke out again. So you shouldn't go to war, in my view, unless you're willing to fight it and end it and deal with the consequences afterwards. Because if you don't do that, I mean, for example, here we had the Gulf War. It was much harder than it really should have been because of some decisions made in the middle of it. The whole issue of whether we should have fought it or not is, that's a whole different issue. But once we started, it was fought, it was won, and then rather than keep troops there, we pulled our troops completely out, didn't do what was needed to maintain peace there, and now we have the problem of ISIS, and it's my belief that we've only guaranteed that there's now going to be a third Gulf War.
Yeah. And, Elgin, to sort of piggyback on what you just said, it is my opinion anyway that democracies make the democratic form of government make it more difficult for countries to sustain wars, because you really have to make the case to the people, whoever the people may be, American or British or German, whatever it might be, that this war is worth continuing to fight and for the purpose. And we can give all kinds of examples from the Civil War on of where the government needs to be able to continue to say to the people who are voting, this is worth doing. And so democracies, I mean, and I'm saying this in a negative and a positive. The positive is that in democracies, you need to be able to sustain the reason for war among the people, because the people get impatient if the war seems to be dragging on too long.
By the same token, in 1938, Chamberlain was trying to seek a peace in Munich, and he was trying to seek the peace because he knew, or at least my interpretation of the situation was, the British did not want to go to war. They were so, what's the word I want? The horrors of World War I were still a critical part of their mentality, and the French were the same way. They did not want to go to war. They were not. The fact they were not prepared to go to war was simply because they didn't want to go to war. So they were attempting something. And going back to something, Alan, I think you said earlier, it fit. Chamberlain seeking peace fit right within the mindset of Hitler.
Right.
He wanted. He knew they would not go to war, and that allowed him to.
Yeah, I think that's why.
Tony, if I make one more quick point here, and that is where I see President Obama right now in the issue with ISIS. The American people do not want to send American troops back to Syria, back to Iraq, and back to it, and so that has to play into the decision, because the American people, in polls at least that I've seen, just don't want it. I mean, you can make a very strong case that going back there and finishing this off is important and a good thing to do. But because the American people are just weary of this, it does put the president in a difficult position.
I would agree. I think one of the issues there, and I would fault Bush on this as well, is you have to lead. This is where leadership comes in. This is one of the reasons Churchill stands out so well, is because of the leadership. He didn't stick his finger in the wind and see which way the polls were going. He argued for his case, and when his case turned out to be true, that's where he now has his place in history.
Yeah,
I think the thing about Churchill was he called World War II the unnecessary war, because had France and England been willing to do something earlier, that war would have never been happened. And I think that's oftentimes where we get. I disagree with Tony on a point made quite a bit earlier I actually support much larger defense spending, because I think what we are seeing right now, that as America is the sole world leader at the moment, as we're pulling back, things are not getting better out there. They're getting worse. We're looking at China and Vietnam, for example, on the verge of going to war because we can't keep enough carriers in the South China Sea. We're seeing tensions around the world growing, and for a little bit of U.S. information here, our Defense Review Board argues we should have 340 ships. We currently have 278, and we're dropping. So we're having to pull back. We're having to take our crews and stretch them any further. And I think that only encourages war. It doesn't actually, prevent it.
Oh, perhaps we should have a hangout on why hindsight is always 2020.
Yeah, except when they didn't keep troops in Iraq, I and quite a few other people predicted that this was going to happen.
No, and I think that's right. I think the reality was, even though, and I was not a fan of the war, I was not a fan of the Iraq War, but I think once you went in and did that, I think you needed to leave troops there. I just think the situation could not be stabilized without a presence there. And I mean, I just don't know how else that could have been accomplished.
Well, we're about out of time. Let me close on use my prerogative as a host here to get one final point. One example, or history's examples that are important to me, is we have a pattern from Korea, we have a pattern from Vietnam. In Korea, we fought, we won, and we left troops there. And today, South Korea is essentially a first world, very prosperous country that we don't even think about anymore. Although the United States still has troops there. Vietnam, we fought and we won, got a peace treaty, and then we cut off aid and abandoned South Vietnam, and Cambodia and the re-education camps followed thereafter. So for me, there's a very clear historical pattern. Unfortunately, I think we're following the Vietnam pattern in Iraq rather than the Korea pattern. That said, let me throw it around for real quickly. We got about a minute here left, so if you can sum up one more time, and then we'll close. Tony, you want to start?
Let me be last because I just lost everybody's conversation.
Chris, you want to go?
Just to say, there is no appetite in the UK for troops on the ground anywhere at the moment, and there's no appetite for increasing defence spending. I don't think whatever happens, you're likely to get any UK support.
Alan?
Well, first let me say how grateful I am to be a participant in this panel with you three wise persons, how much I appreciate your insights. But I would say, as a Christian theologian, as a pastor, in the midst of a world at war, in the midst of a suffering world, I want to ask how will we, as the Church of Jesus Christ, be a suffering presence in the world? Because our Savior certainly was willing to undergo suffering for the sake of the world. What kind of suffering are we willing to endure to bring the healing message of the gospel to those who are hurting?
Tony?
Well, like I said, growing up as an Air Force brat, I have my own view on defense spending. And as long as, but that's for another time. I think as a Christian, I'm like Alan. I think we have to emulate Christ, but I also think we have to somehow remove the suffering by our own personal work, being a Methodist too. That if we're not willing, if we are not willing to go out there and do the things we need to do to end the suffering, then we are failing in our role as a Christian.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and for you out there listening and following along, I want to thank you, and hope you'll join us again next week when we have another discussion on global Christian perspectives.
I'm out of here.
Bye-bye.